The doctor told me Karen had 6 weeks left. She fought for 11. But the hospital bills survived longer than she did. 3 months after I buried my wife, I was still writing checks I could barely afford, answering collection calls with the same hollow sentence I had been using for months. When Titan Systems Group called me into a glass conference room and fired me, 10 days before my $55,000 bonus was supposed to hit my account. Before I tell you how that single decision ended up costing them over $5 million, I want you to understand something. This story is not really about money. It is about what happens when a company mistakes grief for weakness and loyalty for desperation. It is about one contract clause buried on page 7 that nobody in that boardroom had ever bothered to read. And it is about how the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous one. Let me take you back to where this started. My name is Russell Pemberton. Most people call me Russ. I was 52 years old the morning they fired me. And I walked into that conference room carrying 3 things: the grief of a man who had just watched his wife die in a hospice bed, the debt that follows you after $400,000 in medical bills, and 8 years of loyalty to a company that had already decided I was an expense it no longer wanted to carry. Jeanette Marsh was waiting at the end of the glass table. Her hands folded over a thin folder she kept angled away from me. She did not smile. She did not ask how I was holding up. She just clicked her pen twice. The kind of nervous habit that tells you someone rehearsed the conversation but still hates being in the room. And said, "Russ, I'm sorry, but effective immediately. Your position is being eliminated." I had expected bad news walking in. Something felt off the moment I received the calendar invite with no subject line. But hearing those words still hit differently than I had prepared for. There is something about losing your job 3 months after losing your wife that makes every remaining thing feel fragile in a way words cannot fully capture. Across from me sat Brandon Caldwell. He leaned back in his chair with that polished little smirk he wore whenever he believed he had outsmarted someone. His tie was slightly crooked. His shoes were too new, too shiny, the kind you buy when you want people to notice them. Brandon had never closed a government contract in his life. He had never sat through classified briefings, never made red-eye flights to calm down nervous defense executives, never rebuilt the kind of trust with Pentagon procurement officers that takes years and cannot be faked. But somehow, this man was the one deciding what happened to mine. Corporate restructuring, he said, like those 2 words were supposed to erase 8 years of 12-hour days, missed holidays, and the $52 million Project Sentinel contract I had personally secured just 3 weeks earlier. I asked about severance. Jeanette looked down at her papers before answering. 3 weeks. And a positive reference. Assuming no complications. No complication. I let that sit for a second without reacting. I was good at that. 8 years of managing nervous executives in high-stakes negotiations had taught me not to show the face you are actually wearing. But I understood, in that moment, exactly what had happened. Brandon had waited. He had watched me spend 6 months rebuilding Pentagon relationships, sitting through classified briefings, flying across the country on red eyes, calming nervous executives, and finally landing the biggest government contract Titan had secured in years. He let me finish the work, let me get the signature. Let me hand him the keys to a deal worth $52 million. Then, with 10 days left before the bonus cycle closed, he had me removed from payroll, like a line item he could trim to make the numbers look cleaner for the board. In his mind, I imagine I looked exactly like what he needed me to look like. A grieving, indebted widower, exhausted and desperate, who would take 3 weeks of severance, sign whatever they put in front of him, and disappear quietly before anyone started asking questions. What Brandon did not know, and what he never thought to check, was that I had spent the previous night unable to sleep. And sometime after midnight, while sitting in my dark home office with a glass of bourbon and Karen's empty chair across the room, I had opened the fireproof safe in the back of the closet. Not for any particular reason at first. Grief does strange things to the body at night. You find yourself moving through the house, Opening old drawers, touching old things, reaching for something solid when everything else feels like it is dissolving. Inside that safe were the pieces of a life Karen and I had built together. Our marriage certificate, the house deed, insurance policies, tax records, her handwriting on the back of an old envelope. And under all of it, in a cream-colored envelope with the Titan Systems Group logo printed in the upper left corner, was a document I had signed 8 years ago and not opened since. My original employment contract. I took it to my desk and started reading. Most of it was standard language. Duties, confidentiality terms, non-compete clauses, the usual architecture of corporate loyalty written in the passive voice. I moved through it slowly, not looking for anything in particular. Just reading the way you do when the house is too quiet and sleep has abandoned you entirely. Then I reached page 7, section 14, B. The sentence was not long. It was not written in dramatic legal language. It was 12 words. If terminated without cause, employee is entitled to 12% of net quarterly profit. I read it once, then again, then a third time, slower. The way you reread something when your brain is not sure it translated correctly. Not my bonus, not my department's pool, not a discretionary payout that HR could reduce or reclassify. 12% of Titan's net quarterly profit. For a long moment, I just sat there with the page in my hands. The bourbon untouched beside me. The house was completely silent. Outside, it was still dark. Then I remembered the email. About a month earlier, Troy Garrison had accidentally copied me on a financial forecast that was clearly meant for the executive team only. He sent a correction within minutes, and I never mentioned it. But the number had stayed somewhere in the back of my mind, the way relevant information tends to when you have spent years managing high-value contracts. Q3 projected net profit, $42.3 million. Project Sentinel was landing on the books that quarter, and its margins were the kind Brandon had been bragging about in hallway conversations for weeks. I opened the calculator on my phone. 42.3 million multiplied by 0.12. The number appeared in cold white digits against the dark screen. $5,076,000. I set the phone down carefully and did not pick it up again for several minutes. That was not a bonus. That was Karen's medical bills erased. Plus every debt that had been suffocating me. Plus a life I had not allowed myself to imagine since the morning the doctor told me she had 6 weeks. That was the moment the grief in my chest shifted into something different. Not rage. Not the hot, shaking kind of anger that makes you call lawyers at midnight and say stupid things. Something colder than that. Quieter. The kind of focus I remembered from the military. The kind that arrives when the situation is serious enough that emotion becomes a liability you simply cannot afford. Brandon thought he had cheated me out of $55,000 and a few weeks of severance. He had no idea he had just handed me a legal document worth more than $5 million. But I had been around powerful institutions long enough to know that having the right clause is not the same as winning. Brandon was not stupid. He was reckless. But he was also well-resourced. And men like him do not lose cleanly. They build counter-narratives. They find friendly HR staff who develop sudden recollections of performance issues. They locate old emails they can take out of context. They discover concerns they forgot to document at the time. If I walked into a courtroom with Section 14B and nothing else, Titan's legal team would spend the next 18 months turning me into a mediocre employee they had been graciously patient with for years. I needed proof that the termination was genuinely without cause before they had the chance to manufacture a reason, which meant I had to move quietly and fast. The first call I made was to Troy Garrison. Troy and I had served together before either of us understood what a performance review was. Back then, he was the kind of soldier who checked his equipment twice and yours once more without being asked. Not because anyone required it, but because that was simply how he operated. At Titan, he was the same. Quiet. Precise. Detail-oriented in a way that made the people above him uncomfortable because it made their shortcuts visible. He was still inside the company. still had access to systems. Brandon assumed nobody important was monitoring. Asking Troy for help was not a decision I made lightly. If Titan discovered he was providing me with anything, Brandon would come after him next. I had already learned that afternoon that Dorothy Brenner from finance had been let go the same week as me. 25 years at Titan. Gone in the same round of terminations. This was bigger than my bonus. I typed one message to Troy. Need to talk. In person. As soon as you can manage it. He replied in under a minute. Tomorrow. Capitol Grill. 7. The following evening, he was already in the back corner booth when I arrived. One hand wrapped around a beer he had barely touched. He looked tired in the specific way that people look when they have been watching something wrong happen and doing the math on whether saying something is worth what it costs. They're telling people you left voluntarily, he said. Before I even sat down, put out a message to the office. Said you wanted to pursue other opportunities. Generous of them. It gets worse. He glanced toward the bar, lowered his voice slightly. Brandon has been talking about how lean the numbers look before Q3 closes. In meetings, openly, says he cut the fat. The fat being me. You. 2 project managers. Someone from admin. And Dorothy Brenner from finance. 25 years. She raised questions about the Sentinel revenue timing. Troy said. Apparently she thought they were pulling numbers forward too aggressively to inflate Q3. She asked for clarification. Then she kept a copy of her concerns when someone told her to stop asking. That was why Dot was gone. Not restructuring. She had been removed because she saw what they were doing to the quarterly numbers before the board had a chance to question it. She was a problem. So Brandon solved her the same way he solved me 10 days before bonus season. With a thin folder and a polished lie about corporate restructuring. By the time I walked out of the Capitol Grill that night, I was not confused anymore. This was a purge. Monday morning, I walked into the office of Hugh Callahan. Hugh was not the kind of lawyer who kept fresh flowers on the receptionist's desk and offered clients herbal tea before the difficult conversation. He was 62, former military, and occupied a 4th-floor office in an old downtown building with burnt coffee, stacked case files, and a desk that had clearly survived things a desk should not have to survive. He had the eyes of a man who had listened to every variety of lie that money and power produce, and was no longer impressed by any of them. He read my contract in silence. No question, no small talk. Just his finger moving steadily down the pages until it stopped at section 14B. He read it twice. Then he set the contract down on his desk and looked at me directly. This is ironclad, he said. The breath I released must have been audible. But they'll fight it. He added. They will attempt to establish cause after the fact. They'll look for anything they can document, manufacture, or misrepresent. Then we prove they're lying. For the first time in the meeting, Hugh Callahan almost smiled. Now you're thinking correctly. 3 days later, I received a package through an encrypted account Troy had set up. There was no message inside. Just one line, you didn't get this from me. I opened the first attachment and sat very still for a long moment. Performance Improvement Plan. My name at the top. Titan letterhead. HR formatting. Professional enough to frighten someone who did not know what they were looking at. Dated June 18th. I had never seen that document before in my life. The next file was a formal written warning. Dated July 22nd. Another clean, polished, HR-approved document that described a version of my performance history I did not recognize. Then a final review. September 28th. 3 documents. Each one building the same story. Russ Pemberton had been flagged, warned, coached, and finally removed after months of serious concerns. The kind of paper trail that, if you accepted it on face value, turned determination without cause into a very well-documented dismissal with cause. Brandon had built himself a story. He had just forgotten that documents remember when they are born. I right-clicked the first file and opened its properties. The Performance Improvement Plan claimed it had been authored on June 18th. Created October 6th, 9:47 in the morning. I had been fired on October 3rd. My hands went completely still. I checked the second file. Written warning. Dated July 22nd. Created October 6th at 10:03. Third file. Final review. Dated September 28th. Created October 6th at 10:15. 3 fabricated documents. 30 minutes apart. 3 days after my termination. I stared at that screen for a long time. It was not the audacity of it that affected me most. It was the picture of someone sitting in a corporate office 3 days after I had walked out with a cardboard box. My wife, 3 months in the ground and her bills still on my counter. Calmly inventing a paper trail to make sure I could not fight back. Not in anger. In procedure. Like it was just another Monday morning task on the calendar. The next file was worse. It was an email chain between Brandon Caldwell and Andrea Fielding. Titans Corporate Counsel. Subject line, Workforce Optimization, Pre-Bonus. Dated September 20th. 2 weeks before they called me into that conference room. Brandon had written need to reduce headcount by 5 before Q3 closes. Targeting high salary positions. Priority is keeping the executive team clean for board review. Andrea had replied, ensure performance documentation is in place before any terminations. Will need to justify cause, if challenged. I read that exchange 3 times. There it was. Not bad timing. Not an impulsive decision by a careless manager. A planned strategy. Documented in writing. To fire specific employees before bonus season, and then create paperwork retroactively to defend it. They had chosen the targets, assigned the justification, and executed the plan on schedule. The only thing they had not done was read page 7 of my original employment contract. That night, Hugh and I built the case. The fabricated documents. The metadata proving they were created after my termination. The email chain between Brandon and Andrea. Planning the cuts and the cover. Dorothy's notes on the Q3 revenue adjustments. The Sentinel contract margins being accelerated into the quarter in a way that made executive bonuses look more impressive than the actual business performance warranted. The projected net profit $42.3 million. 12% of that number $5 million. $76,000. Hugh assembled everything into a legal letter that did not raise its voice. It did not threaten dramatic consequences or make emotional appeals. It was precise, factual, and cold in the way that documents carrying serious weight tend to be. It informed Titan Systems Group that per Section 14B of my employment contract, I was owed 12% of the company's net quarterly profit following a termination without cause. It attached the relevant evidence. It noted that fabricated performance records, pre-planned terminations, and potential financial manipulation connected to the Sentinel contract had been identified and preserved. He gave them 10 business days to resolve the matter. If they declined, we would file suit and contact the appropriate federal regulators regarding the financial irregularities Dorothy had documented. The letter went by certified mail the following morning. The silence lasted 5 days. Then a courier appeared at my front door with a thick envelope from a law firm whose name I recognized as expensive. Inside was their first settlement offer. $175,000. Standard confidentiality agreement. Full release of all claims. No admission of wrongdoing. I called Hugh. They offered $175. I said. He laughed once. A low, dry sound. That means they're scared. It's not close. No. He said. It is bait. They are measuring how desperate you are. They believe grief and debt made you fragile enough to accept anything that sounds significant. I looked at the stack of Karen's medical bills on my desk. I had arranged them in a neat pile weeks ago because looking at chaos had stopped being something I could tolerate. The total stared back at me from the top page. $397,842. They had miscalculated again. 2 days after we formally rejected their offer, Andrea Fielding called. Her voice had the careful steadiness of someone who had been told what tone to use before dialing. Neutral. Professional. Approaching warmth without quite reaching it. Mr. Pemberton. Titan would like to schedule a meeting to discuss resolution options. Who will be in the room? I asked. Our legal team. Your counsel? Mr. Caldwell and Mr. Holbrook. That last name changed the air in the conversation. Lawrence Holbrook was the CEO. He had built Titan into a defense consultancy worth real money. Back when the company was still run on something resembling principle. He had not been visible during any of this. Not the termination. Not the settlement letter. Not the rejected offer. Somewhere between October 3rd and now. This problem had climbed high enough to land on his desk. They were no longer managing me through HR. They were sending in the person who could actually make decisions. The following Tuesday, Hugh and I walked back into Titan headquarters. Same building. Same polished floors. Same security guard who nodded at me without recognizing why I looked familiar. But everything about the walk through that lobby felt different from every other time I had made it. I was not arriving to work. I was not carrying a project proposal or a client deck. I was carrying proof. The conference room was cold. Glass table. Leather chairs. Water bottles lined up in a row with the kind of careful symmetry that someone arranges when they want the room to feel like they are in control. Brandon was already seated when I walked in. He did not stand. He gave me a small nod. The quick, confident kind. The gesture of a man who still believed this meeting was a formality he was going to manage. It was the last confident thing I ever saw him do. Lawrence Holbrook sat 2 seats to his left. Silver-haired. Hands folded. Watching without expression. Andrea opened with the standard corporate approach. A misunderstanding. Context that had not been fully communicated. A desire to reach a fair outcome for all parties. Hugh cut her off gently but completely. There is no misunderstanding. Your client terminated Mr. Pemberton without cause and subsequently created false documentation to retroactively justify it. The evidence is in this room. He slid a flash drive across the table. Andrea plugged it in. The performance improvement plan appeared on the wall screen. Dated June 18th. Hugh clicked to the file properties. Created October 6th. 3 days after my termination. The room was quiet. Written warning. Same problem. Final review. Same problem. 3 documents. 3 lies. 30 minutes apart. 3 days too late. I watched Brandon's face and saw the exact moment he understood what he was looking at. The color left him quickly, starting around the jaw and moving upward. His fingers began doing something repetitive against the table edge. A small tapping movement he probably did not notice. Hugh moved to the next file. The email chain appeared on the screen. Brandon's words in plain text, targeting high salary positions. Priority is keeping the executive team clean for board review. Andrea's reply below it. Ensure performance documentation is in place before any terminations. Holbrook's expression did not change visibly, but something tightened around his eyes. Then came Dorothy's notes. The Q3 adjustments. The Sentinel revenue being accelerated into the quarter to inflate the profit number. The same quarter whose margins Brandon had been bragging about in hallways. This was no longer a story about one disputed termination. This was forged records, pre-planned terminations, and documented financial manipulation that could attract federal attention. And the man who had orchestrated it was sitting 2 seats to the left of the CEO. For the first time since I had known him, Brandon had nothing to say. His mouth opened once and closed without producing a sound. He touched his tie. He looked at Andrea, who did not look back. He looked at Holbrook. And Holbrook turned his head toward him with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who has already made a decision. Brandon, Holbrook said. Sir, I can explain. Step outside. Brandon blinked. I think it would be better if I remained to provide some context. Holbrook's voice did not rise. It lowered. You are the context. Brandon pushed his chair back. It rolled into the wall behind him harder than he intended. He grabbed his phone from the table, fumbled it briefly, then walked toward the door with the careful, stiff movements of someone trying not to let a room full of people see how badly they want to run. The door clicked shut. Nobody spoke for him. Holbrook cleared the room. The junior lawyers packed their things without being told twice. Andrea gathered her papers and left without asking whether she should stay. And then it was just the three of us in a cold conference room. Surrounded by the evidence Brandon had spent 3 days in October, building in 30 seconds that morning, destroying. Holbrook unfolded his hands. "Mr. Pemberton," he said, "I think we are past the point of negotiating whether Titan owes you something." "We are," I agreed. He reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the table between us. Final audited net profit for Q3 came to $42,566,000. 12% of that figure equals $5,107,920. We can have that transferred within 3 business days. Hugh opened the folder first. He read every page. His expression did not move, which was how I knew the offer was real. No reclassification language. No hidden adjustment formula. The number on the page was the number he had said aloud. I looked at Holbrook. "I have 2 conditions before I sign anything." He held my gaze without interrupting. "Dorothy Brenner receives a consulting agreement in the amount of $400,000. She spent 25 years at this company, identified a financial problem that should have been corrected, and was removed for doing her job honestly. She deserves more than a box and a 3-week check." Holbrook was quiet for a moment. "Done." Troy Garrison is promoted to senior engineer. Official title. Appropriate salary. And backdated equity consideration for the 2 years he has been performing the role without the recognition. He has been doing senior-level work while being managed as a cost to minimize. Holbrook leaned back slightly and looked at me with something that was not quite surprise. "You are taking care of your people. I am describing what accountability looks like," I said, "not just for the wrong things, but for the right ones." He held my gaze for another moment. Then he said, "Agreed. Paperwork by end of business today." As Hugh gathered the signed documents, Holbrook stood and extended his hand. I shook it. The fight was finished. That was the extent of what the handshake meant. Then he said, "Russ, we would like you to seriously consider returning. Senior Vice President. Meaningful compensation. Full authority over government accounts." The room went quiet in a specific way. 8 years ago, that sentence would have meant everything to me. I looked around the conference room. The glass walls, the polished table, the same building that had handed me a cardboard box 10 days before payday and invented 3 fake documents to make sure I could not argue about it. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I am done working inside institutions that need lawyers to explain ethics to them." Then I walked out the same way I had walked in, quietly, without hurry, without looking back. 3 business days later, the wire cleared. $5,107,920. I sat in front of my laptop and looked at the number for a long time without moving. I did not feel what I expected to feel. There was no triumphant rush, no sudden lightness, just a quiet, steady recognition that something that had been pressing against my chest since Karen died had finally been lifted. I opened the hospital billing portal. Karen Elizabeth Pemberton. Outstanding balance, $397,842.16. I clicked Pay in Full. The system processed slowly, the kind of processing pause that feels longer than it actually is. Then the balance changed. $0. I paid the mortgage next. The truck. The collection notices stacked beside my printer. One by one. Every number that had been following me since the diagnosis disappeared. The envelopes that kept arriving after the funeral stopped meaning anything. By sunset, the house was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. The next call I made was to Dorothy Brenner. She answered on the third ring, tired in the way people sound when a company has convinced them that their value expired. Dot. Check your email, I said. Pause. The soft sound of a mouse click. Then silence long enough that I almost spoke again. Russ, she said, very quietly. This says $400,000. It says consulting agreement. I told her, because 2.5 decades of doing honest work deserves better than being thrown out for asking the right questions. She did not say anything for a moment. I did not fill the silence. Thank you, she finally said. Later that afternoon, Troy called me. He was talking and laughing at the same time, and occasionally saying words that should not be included in any script intended for a general audience. You did this, he said when he calmed down enough to form a complete sentence. You did this years ago. I told him. I just made them say it out loud. Brandon Caldwell's departure from Titan was announced on LinkedIn 2 weeks later. The post used the same empty language they had tried to use on me pursuing other opportunities. His profile went dark the same day. No farewell message. No carefully crafted leadership quote. No announcement about his next chapter. Just a name that disappeared from the company page the way names do when the departure is not entirely voluntary. But in the defense industry, where contracts are built on relationships and cleared employees talk to each other across organizations, silence is not the same as invisibility. The story did not need a headline. It moved the way these things always move, from a quiet mention in one conversation to a careful pause in another. From a recruiter making calls to an executive deciding which names to forward. Brandon had forged performance records, coordinated pre-bonus terminations, and tried to bury an employee who had personally secured a $52 million government contract. By the time he was looking for his next position, the people who mattered already knew the shape of that story. The doors were closing before he reached them. 3 weeks after everything settled, a call came from Paul Rivera, former Marine colonel, running a small defense consultancy in Arlington with maybe a dozen senior advisors and the kind of culture that does not bother performing for people who are not in the room. We do not need someone to live in the office, he said. We need someone who understands that government relationships are built on trust, not on the PowerPoint slides. Your bonus depends on. I started the following Monday. 3 days a week. My own schedule. No corporate theater. No budget politics. No one waiting around the corner to steal the contract you just spent 6 months closing. Just clean work with people who had decided that doing things right was the only strategy worth having. Karen would have approved. Most of the money stayed invested. I was not built for the kind of spending that looks like relief but actually feels like distraction. I fixed the foundation on the house. Because it needed it, and because Karen had mentioned it twice. I replaced the truck with something that would not strand me on the highway in February. Beyond that, the number sat in accounts where it could do something useful. Then I created the Karen Pemberton Fund for cancer research. Not a large foundation. Not built for attention. $50,000 a year to a research hospital in Baltimore that had focused specifically on the kind of cancer that took her from me in 11 weeks. Several months later, they invited me to see where the contributions were going. There was a small plaque in the research wing. Karen Elizabeth Pemberton, 1973 to 2025. I stood in front of it longer than I planned to. I touched the edge of it once. Just briefly. The way you touch something when you want the moment to be real. I did not cry there, but I understood. Standing in that corridor. What the whole long, terrible year had eventually been for. Not the money. Not the settlement. Not even justice. Exactly. It was the chance to turn the worst thing that happened to me into something that might save someone else from losing the person they loved to the same disease. I hope it does. 4 months later, I received an email from a woman named Jennifer Pace. She had worked at Titan several years before I arrived. She had been let go during a different round of restructuring and had always suspected her performance reviews were fabricated too. But she had no evidence. No money for lawyers, and not enough left in her to keep fighting after they took her job and her dignity in the same morning. Her last line stayed with me longer than anything else from that year. What you did mattered. Not just for you. For all of us who had to leave quietly. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I understood something I had not fully understood during the fight itself. I had been thinking about this as my story. My contract. My wife's bills. My survival. But sometimes when one person refuses to disappear, it changes the calculation for everyone who was watching and wondering whether fighting back was even possible. Sometimes refusing to be buried is the most important thing you can do. Not for yourself. For the people who come after. Some nights I still sit in that home office with 1 glass of bourbon and Karen's empty chair across from me. The house is paid off now. Repaired. Warm. But the quiet is still the quiet of a house built for 2 people and currently occupied by 1. And I do not expect that to change. I think about how close I came to taking the 3 weeks of severance and the positive reference, and walking away too tired to do anything else. There were moments in that first week when the debt was so heavy and the grief was so constant that fighting felt like a luxury I could not justify. I think about what saved me. It was not rage. Rage makes noise and burns out. It was not pride. Pride makes decisions based on how things look rather than what they accomplish. It was patience. And attention. And the habit of keeping everything that matters in a fireproof safe. It was a contract I had signed 8 years earlier and never thrown away. It was page 7. People like Brandon Caldwell count on good people being too exhausted, too afraid, or too broken to read the fine print. They count on grief, making you desperate enough to accept whatever sounds like relief. They count on the fact that most people, when they are standing at the worst point in their lives, do not have the bandwidth to be methodical. They are often right, but not always. Contracts have memory. Documents have fingerprints. And metadata, as it turns out, is not something you can forge your way around. Brandon gave me a 12% advantage the moment he said position eliminated instead of anything else. He just never read the contract. So if you are listening to this while someone is trying to convince you that you have no options, that the system is too big, that you are too small, that walking away is the only realistic choice, check the safe first. Read the fine print. Keep the emails. Save the screenshots. Talk to the right people. Move quietly and methodically. The way you do when the situation is serious enough that emotion is a liability. The most dangerous person in a negotiation is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it is the quiet one who kept every single receipt. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more true life stories about betrayal, accountability, and the kind of justice that arrives when you are least expecting it. Leave a like. And tell me in the comments, would you have accepted the settlement? Or would you have fought it all the way to the end?